All right, welcome back everyone for part 2 of our deep dive into modern Indian history, especially for those of you gearing up for the UPSC GS1 exam. We're here to break down this era in a way that's actually, engaging. And hey, even if you're not prepping for exams, stick around. Modern Indian history is packed with fascinating figures, and today we're diving into one who's a real triple threat.
Triple threat, huh? Intriguing.
Yeah, think spiritual leader, philosopher, and social reformer all in one. We're talking about Swami Vivekananda. And trust me, his story is anything BUT, your typical dry history lesson.
Oh, I'm already hooked. Swami Vivekananda. All right, bring it on. I know a bit about him, but I'm always up for learning more, especially if it helps our listeners ace those UPSC exams or just get a better grasp of this period in India's history. So where do we begin?
Well, we're pulling insights from this source here, a document simply titled MFO36.pdf. Don't let that plain name fool ya. It's got all the juicy details about Vivekananda's life, his teachings, and why he's still such a big deal in modern India, even over a century after his death. And one thing that always gets me is how a simple name change can totally signal a huge shift, right?
Yeah, I see where you're going with this. A name change is more than just a name change. It's symbolic, right?
Right. Like our source mentions, he was born Narendranath Datta in 1863, totally normal name for the time. But later on, a Maharaja requests he take on this new name, Vivekananda, and boom, history's changed.
It's like destiny calling or something, right? I mean, think about all the figures throughout history who underwent these significant name changes that often marked a turning point in their lives or signaled some profound transformation.
Yeah, and it's not just some random coincidence. It's almost like foreshadowing the massive impact he was going to have. He took on this new identity, one that really resonated with this whole message of like spiritual awakening and national pride.
There is a national pride. That's key, especially during this period of British rule. I bet this resonated with so many people at the time looking for a sense of identity and hope amidst, colonial rule.
Totally. And speaking of impact, think about this. His birth anniversary is celebrated as National Youth Day in India. That right there tells you how much his message still inspires, especially younger generations.
Oh, absolutely. And for all our UPSC folks out there, this is something to underline in your notes. Vivekananda's ideas, they weren't just relevant back then. They're still shaping how we think about India's development, its role in the world, even its social fabric today. It's all connected.
Okay, so let's get into some of those big ideas. One phrase that really jumped out at me from the source was harmony between spirituality and material progress. It's like he was bridging this gap that honestly still exists today, right? Like, can you be spiritual A&D want material success?
That's such a great point. You see a lot of spiritual traditions, they kind of encourage you to withdraw from the world, right? Like renounce material possessions and all that. But Vivekananda, he was different.
Yeah, he didn't see it as this either-or situation. Like, you can't be both spiritual and successful.
Right. He saw no conflict between spiritual growth and material advancement. In fact, he believed that for real progress, you kind of need both. Like, they got to work together,
So he wasn't about hiding away in some cave and just meditating, right?
Yeah.
He was more about engaging with the world, making things better, but like not losing that spiritual core, that inner compass, I guess.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially for anyone prepping for the UPSC. Imagine you're tackling an essay question, right? Something on India's economic development, for example.
Oh, I see. So like instead of just listing off economic indicators and policies,
Yeah.
you could actually bring in Vivekananda's idea.
Yeah. Boom. You got it. Argue for a more holistic approach to development, one that's not just about GDP growth, but also considers ethical values, social well-being, that spiritual dimension that often gets left out. It's a way to add depth and originality to your answer, really make it stand out.
Makes sense. You're not just regurgitating textbook stuff. You're actually bringing in these unique perspectives, showing the examiners you can think critically and connect ideas across different domains. It's all about showing them you can analyze, synthesize, all that good stuff.
Exactly. So yeah, Vivekananda, he wasn't just a spiritual dude. He was also this sharp social commentator, a thinker who was grappling with some of the core challenges facing India back then, challenges that honestly are still relevant today.
Right. So we've got this idea of like blending spirituality with material progress. Right?
Yeah.
But there's also this huge moment in his life that our source highlights. The 1893 World Parliament of Religions in Chicago.
Yeah.
Now picture this, an Indian monk on a global stage just captivating the West with his ideas.
Whoa, wait, hold on. I'm picturing it right now. 1893, that's during British rule, right? To have an Indian figure commanding that much respect and attention from the West, that's huge. Talk about challenging stereotypes and making people rethink their whole perception of India.
Right. It wasn't just him representing Hinduism or even just India. He was representing this broader idea, the source calls it the universality of religions.
Ah, so he was emphasizing the common ground, the shared humanity that underlies all these different faiths. Love that. That message is like timeless, you know?
It's so relevant, even more so
Yeah.
today, right? With all the divisions and conflicts we see based on religion and other differences, it's like he was ahead of his time, advocating for dialogue and understanding when others were focusing on what separates us.
100%. And for those of you gearing up for the UPSC, this is prime essay material right here. Think about it. You could totally get a question asking you to analyze how historical figures like Vivekananda contributed to India's soft power on the world stage.
Yeah, it's not just about what happened in the past. It's about how those events and ideas still shape India's image and influence today. It's all connected. So we've got this incredible speaker, the thinker challenging the status quo, but our source makes it clear he wasn't just all talk, right?
Oh, definitely not. Vivekananda was all about action. He wasn't content with just sharing lofty philosophies. He wanted to see real change in the world, real impact.
And that's where those four paths to liberation come in, right?
Yeah.
Source mentions them, Raja, Karma, Jnana, Bhakti Yoga. It's like he was giving people different ways to connect with their spirituality and live a more meaningful life. Like, hey, there's not just one right way. Find what works for you.
Exactly. He recognized that not everyone connects with the divine in the same way. It's like some folks are drawn to meditation, right? Others find their path through selfless service, or maybe it's devotion or intellectual inquiry that really lights their fire. He was offering a path for everyone, super inclusive, you know.
To help our listeners really get this, could you give us a quick example of one of these paths? Like, what does it actually look like in practice?
Okay, let's take karma yoga, for example. This is the path of selfless action, where you dedicate your actions to a higher purpose without expecting anything in return. It's all about finding fulfillment through serving others.
So it's not just about like meditating in a cave and reaching enlightenment for yourself, right? It's about taking that inner peace and using it to make a positive difference in the world around you.
Precisely. And this is where Vivekananda's ideas start to resonate with, like, the whole social and political landscape of modern India. The source even mentions how figures like Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose admired him, which shows how his teachings influenced not just spiritual seekers, but also people who were fighting for India's freedom and social progress.
Wow, so his influence was far-reaching, impacting all these different spheres of Indian society, not just religion, but also politics and social movements. Speaking of impact, we got to talk about those organizations he founded. The source lists a whole bunch: Ramakrishna Mission, Balur Math, Advaita Ashrama, Vedanta societies. It's a lot to take in.
Oh yeah, it's a whole lot. And it really shows how Vivekananda was all about putting his vision into action. It wasn't just abstract ideas for him. He created institutions to carry out his mission, address social needs, and really spread his teachings far and wide.
Okay, so for anyone prepping for the UPSC, do they need to know the ins and outs of every single organization, or is there a bigger takeaway here?
While knowing the basic aims of each organization can definitely come in handy, the bigger picture is this. Vivekananda was all about action, not just words. He took his lofty ideals and turned them into tangible initiatives that actually aim to uplift society.
It's like, yeah, anyone can talk about change, but actually building the structures and systems to make it happen, that's a whole other level. And honestly, that's a valuable lesson for anyone, really, not just those taking the UPSC.
Absolutely. It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And that's what makes Vivekananda such a compelling figure, both historically and for our understanding of modern India. And, you know, for our listeners out there who are into current events, a lot of these organizations are still doing amazing work today. I mean, think about it. Understanding what they're doing now can actually give you some really valuable insights into social issues and even how India's developing overall. So it's a win-win, especially if you're prepping for the UPSC. You're getting your history fix A&D, keeping up with current affairs all at once.
Okay, I like that. Let's unpack some of these organizations a bit more then, especially for those UPSC folks who are always looking for those connections between past and present. The Ramakrishna Mission seems like a good place to start, right?
Yeah.
I mean, everyone's heard of them, but I'm not sure everyone really knows the full scope of what they do.
Yeah, that's a good one. They were founded in 1897, and they're honestly one of the most active and influential organizations that came from Vivekananda's teachings. And what's super interesting, especially for our listeners aiming for the UPSC, is just how much they do. They don't just focus on one or two things. It's a whole spectrum of work.
All right, so what kind of spectrum are we talking about here? Because I remember this has mentioned things like value-based education, preserving culture, healthcare,
Yeah.
but also women's empowerment, helping tribal communities, even disaster relief. That's a huge range.
It is, and that's exactly what makes them so relevant for the UPSC. These are the issues that are constantly in the news, both in India and around the world. So whether you're thinking about the role of NGOs in rural development, or how to prepare for disasters, or even the challenges of making sure everyone's included, the Ramakrishna Mission is often right there, working on the front lines of all these things.
So it's like having a real-life example right there, ready to use in those UPSC essays or even in your interview. Knowing how they work could be a total game changer, especially if you need to show you understand how those big historical figures and their ideas actually play out in the real world.
You got it. That's why connecting history and current events is so powerful. It's not just about memorizing facts and dates. It's about seeing how the past shapes what's happening right now. And the Ramakrishna Mission is a perfect example of that.
Okay, we've covered the Ramakrishna Mission. What about Balur Math? The source mentions that too. Is it more of a spiritual center, or do they do outreach programs like the mission?
Balur Math is a bit different. It's actually got a really unique place in Vivekananda's legacy. It was set up in 1899, and it's the headquarters for both the Ramakrishna Math and the mission.
So it's like
Right.
the main hub, right? The source mentioned it was where Vivekananda chose to stay permanently, so it's got that spiritual significance.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also the place where they run all the activities of the whole organization.
It's like the brain, sending signals out to all of the different parts of the Ramakrishna movement.
Perfect analogy. And that makes Balur Math important for a couple of reasons. First, it's the link between Vivekananda's teachings and how they're actually put into practice. It's not just for meditation and stuff, it's the place where all those social service initiatives get started.
Right, because for any movement to succeed, you need more than just a charismatic leader, right? You need that structure, the coordination, the people working behind the scenes to keep everything running smoothly.
Exactly. And second, understanding Balur Math's role helps us understand the way Vivekananda organized everything, which is actually pretty important for understanding how social movements grow and keep going, especially those with spiritual roots.
Okay, so we've got those two big players, the Ramakrishna Mission with all its outreach, and Balur Math running the show. But the source also mentions the Advaita Ashrama and the Vedanta societies. What's their deal and how do they fit in?
Great question. Both of those reflect different parts of Vivekananda's teachings, but with a bit of a different focus. The Advaita Ashrama, that one was founded in Mayavati, and it's all about the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta.
Isn't that the one that's all about the oneness of reality? Bit more philosophical, I guess. Less about hands-on social work.
You got it. Their main activities, according to the source, are things like printing books, organizing retreats, and providing some education and healthcare. So they do help people, but it all comes from this very specific philosophical viewpoint.
Interesting. So for those gearing up for the UPSC, knowing about the Advaita Ashram could be useful for questions about how Indian philosophical thought developed, or maybe even the role ashrams play in society.
Absolutely. It's another piece of Vivekananda's legacy, showing how his ideas spread into all these different areas. It wasn't just about social reform, it was about changing the intellectual and spiritual landscape of India, too.
Okay, and what about those Vedanta societies? The source says they were started in the U.S. and other parts of the world, so they sound a bit more international, right?
They are. And that shows just how far Vivekananda's message reached. These societies are all about making Vedanta philosophy accessible to a wider audience, especially in the West.
So it's more about spreading the teachings, less about the on-the-ground work that the mission does in India.
Exactly. Think of them as places to explore and learn about these ideas, whereas the mission is more about getting things done and helping people directly.
So it's like a spectrum, right? You've got the Ramakrishna Mission on one end, deeply involved in social service. Then the Vedanta societies on the other focus more on spreading those philosophical ideas. And in the middle, you've got Balur Math and the Advaita Ashrama, each doing their own thing, mixing spiritual and social engagement in their own way.
That's a great way to put it. And for our listeners, that's how you start connecting the dots and really understanding the impact of a historical figure. It's not about memorizing every detail. It's about seeing the patterns, the connections, the different ways their legacy unfolds.
Right, because that's how you go from just knowing information to actually understanding it, which is exactly what the UPSC is all about, right?
Precisely. Now, before we wrap up the section, I want to mention another organization that pops up in the source, even though Vivekananda didn't actually start it himself. It's called the Bharat Savashram Sangha.
Oh, interesting. Why do they stand out, especially if they weren't directly founded by Vivekananda?
What's really cool is that even though they weren't his creation, they were totally inspired by his teachings, especially his focus on serving others and making society better. Their main work is all about helping people, tackling problems like poverty, healthcare, and disaster relief.
So it's a perfect example of how his ideas kept spreading, inspiring people to take action even after he was gone. That says a lot about his influence, right?
Absolutely. It shows how powerful ideas can be, how they can go beyond one person and inspire whole groups of people to work together. And for the UPSC, this is a really important point. When you're studying these figures, don't just look at what they did directly, pay attention to the bigger impact of their ideas and how they keep inspiring others.
Right, because sometimes the stuff that happens indirectly is even more powerful. It's about how they start movements, inspire organizations, and influence how people think for generations. And that's definitely something to keep in mind for the UPSC.
You got it. The Bharat Savashram Sangha is a perfect example of that. It highlights how Vivekananda's ideas kept rippling outward, inspiring social action even after he was gone.
Well, I think we've done a pretty deep dive into all those organizations linked to Vivekananda, looking at their history and how they might be relevant for the UPSC. It's clear that his impact goes way beyond just his teachings. It's about the real changes these organizations have made and still make in India.
And I hope our listeners are starting to see how understanding these organizations can give them an edge when they're prepping for the UPSC. It's about connecting the dots, seeing the big picture, and understanding how history shapes what's going on today.
All right, so we've covered a ton of ground here, from Vivekananda's early life and that whole transformation to this idea of like bringing spirituality and material progress together. But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to our UPSC folks and anyone else out there just fascinated by this era in Indian history. Like, you had to pick one key takeaway about Vivekananda. What's the absolute must remember for anyone tackling the UPSC or even just trying to understand modern India?
Ooh, that's a tough one. But I think the real essence of Vivekananda is this. He truly embodies all the complexities of modern India in a way few others did.
So it's not just memorizing his name and some dates, right? It's about understanding him as this like symbol of all the forces shaping India at that time.
Exactly. He was this amazing mix of spiritual leader, social reformer, philosopher, and this passionate believer in India's potential on the world stage. It's like he was hitting all the key themes of the era.
Which, for the UPSC, that's golden, right? You're not just spitting back facts, you're analyzing, you're synthesizing, connecting it all to a bigger narrative.
Exactly. And Vivekananda's life, his teachings, they give you this rich tapestry to do just that. It's like a framework for grasping those nuances of India's transition to modernity.
It's almost like he's giving you a cheat sheet for the exam, but one that forces you to actually think critically and really engage with the material.
I love that. A cheat sheet that makes you smarter, not lazier. And that's what makes studying history so rewarding, especially when you're prepping for a tough exam like the UPSC. It's about wrestling with these big ideas, understanding the context, and seeing how they still resonate today.
Okay, so I think our listeners are getting the message. Vivekananda is more than just a name in a textbook. He's like a key to unlocking this deeper understanding of modern India.
And hopefully they're also seeing how diving deep like this can really help them with their UPSC prep. It's about going beyond the surface, exploring those connections, and grasping the big picture.
It's about learning to think like a historian, which, let's be honest, is a useful skill no matter what you end up doing in life.
100%. And on that note, I think we've covered an impressive amount of ground today.
We started with Vivekananda's early life and how he transformed himself, then got into that core message of his about finding harmony between spiritual and material progress.
We talked about that super impactful speech at the World Parliament of Religions, his practical teachings on those different paths to liberation, and of course, how he influenced modern Indian thought.
And we can't forget those organizations he inspired, the Ramakrishna Mission, Bill Math, all of them. We saw how relevant they still are in India today.
It's clear that Vivekananda's legacy is multifaceted and continues to shape India's social, spiritual, and intellectual landscape in really profound ways.
Absolutely. I think it's safe to say this has been a fascinating deep dive into the life and legacy of this truly extraordinary figure.
And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep digging into those topics that spark your curiosity. Never let that love of learning die out.
Because there's always something new to discover, something that might just change how you see the world.
Beautifully said. And on that note, a huge thank you to all of you for joining us on the deep dive.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into these fascinating historical figures and the ideas that shaped our world. And until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those brains buzzing.